Hello, welcome to another gardening Q&A live on White Baby Gardening and Worm Farm. So today we are going to be discussing common gardening mistakes. As you know, from time to time we all make mistakes, and especially so if we are a young gardener or new to gardening, then we are prone to making more mistakes. Hi, wood chip gardener, how are you? Right, so let's look at some of the mistakes that we tend to make as gardeners. Oh, hi, Han White. Hi, Chanel. So one of the biggest mistakes that is common among new gardeners is that they tend to start their gardens too big, and then it is hard to manage because if they are beginners, chances are they will not have enough experience to deal with all the various plants that they are growing. And then as you're growing these plants and you're learning more, sometimes you're fortunate enough where you start with a big garden and you do pretty well. Hi, Precious. How are you? So sometimes as a beginner, you might start with a big garden and you might be fortunate enough to be very successful at it. But then for the most part, if you're a beginner, you'll find that different plants will face different issues, and knowing how to deal with those issues, what to do to prevent those issues can be a challenge. Okay, you're doing well, you're at work. Okay, thank you for taking the time to join the live. Right, so that is one of the biggest mistakes that people tend to make. So if you are a beginner, then you want to select a handful of plants that you want to grow. And as you gain more experience, then you will decide to extend your garden some more. It can be very frustrating as a beginner if what you're growing tend to be problematic. So say for example, your plants are turning yellow and you don't know why they're turning yellow, or your plants are having pests and you don't know how to deal with that type of pest. So it can be frustrating as a beginner if your garden is not doing well. So starting small is one way to help you to cope with whatever challenge the garden may face. So if you're a beginner to gardening, then it is recommended that you at least spend some time to know the plants you're growing and the most common problems that these plants may face, and talk to your neighbors, fellow gardeners who have grown these type of plants, because they can offer practical suggestions that can help you to have a successful garden. Okay, so that is one mistake that gardeners make. So the second mistake that gardeners tend to make is that they may plant too deep or too shallow. There are some plants like onions that like to be planted shallow, while there are others that love to be planted deep. And for these plants that love to be planted deep, some of them will actually produce root on the entire section that is underground. Some plants, if you plant them too deep, the plant will rot because not all plants will produce roots along the stem. So some of them will rot. So you need to be careful. Know the plants that you're growing, know the ones that can be planted deep and the ones that should not be. Okay, so the next problem that gardeners face is either overwatering or underwatering their plants. Now, plants need moisture in order to transport nutrients from the soil. So, if there is not enough moisture, then your plants won't have enough nutrients, which will lead to the plant dying if you do not rectify the problem as quickly as possible. Now, water also helps to regulate the temperature of your plants. So it is important that you ensure that your plants have adequate amount of moisture. Now, if your plants do not have enough moisture, then chances are it won't produce as much as it should, whether it is a foliage producing plant or it is a fruit producing plant. If it does not have enough moisture, then it will not be able to produce as much as it should. Another thing with overwatering is that it can cause the root of your plants to rot. So you don't want to overwater your plants. And this happens because as you saturate your soil and the soil becomes oversaturated, the water particles will fill in the gaps where you would have air. And so the plant root will not be able to produce or get enough oxygen. Let's see. Hi, Helpy. How are you? How do you remedy too much water? Well, the only thing that you can do in the case of seedlings, if you have too much water, then you can turn on a fan in that location, or if they're indoors and it is possible to move them outdoors where they're exposed to the wind, provided they're strong enough to withstand the wind, then that is how you would dry them out. If it is any other plant, like planted in the ground or in containers outside, there isn't much you can do more than just simply wait for the water to dry out. And you want to make sure that you do not water it again. So you might see the top of the soil looking dry, but it does not necessarily mean that the bottom of the soil or the bottom of the container that you're growing in is dry. So you want to allow it to have a good amount of time. Of course, it is a good idea to check the soil to see how deep down the water level is at, because you don't want to allow it to dry out too much, and yet again you don't want to be overwatering it. LP says you still don't have your monetization up, but you're still over 1,000. Oh, I've been monetized for I think a little bit over a week now, LP. Yeah. Okay, you're doing well. That's good. Yes. Shortly, the day after we spoke, LP, I got monetized. I think 2 or 3 days after that. Yeah. Thanks for being concerned. Yes, so airflow is very important when it comes to plants. So you don't want to over water your plants. Now, why here is so important to the root of your plants is that it also influences the availability of nutrients from the soil. So if you overwater your plants, then you're actually preventing your plants from getting sufficient nutrients from the soil. See, LP says, I don't see the super chat button by the comment box. Okay, I'm not sure if I've enabled the super chat, but when you watch my videos, you will notice that there is an ad at the front or the back of the video. Yes, but I don't recall enabling the super chat. I'm still working out the kinks because technology and I are not friends. So I have to spend my little time and do some research to know what I need to do and what not to do. Oh, yes, and to answer your question, I'm doing okay too. Yes. Another reason why you do not want to overwater your plant is that it can also encourage certain plant disease. There are some plants that do not like a lot of moisture. Some plants like a lot of moisture. So you don't want to overwater. So it is a good idea to know those plants that love to have a lot of moisture and those that doesn't. Okay. Another reason why, one other mistake, sorry, that gardeners will make is either over fertilizing or under fertilizing their plants. Too much fertilizer will actually burn your plants. too little fertilizer will cause your plants to be not malnourished. They will be dwarf or stunted, and then the produce will not be as good as it should be if it produces anything at all. So we want to strive to keep a balance with how much nutrients we give our plants. Now, there are those of us who will add the nutrients to the entire garden, same amount to all of the garden. And then each time we're topping up our plants, we top up either the entire garden or individual plants, giving them the same amount. But there are some plants that require more nutrients than others. So it is good to know those plants that are heavy feeders and ensure that they have sufficient nutrients to keep them going. And then there are those plants that burn easily if they don't have, I mean, yes, if they have too much nutrients. And then there's some, so you want to make sure that you keep the balance between the heavy feeders and the light feeders and making sure that each of them have what they require. Let's see, Helpy says, hello, Hell. I have zero idea what to do, but most people I've seen who are monetized have a little $sign in the comment box to send a super chat. Oh, okay. Yes, I was doing a little bit of reading on the super chat, but I am so busy these days. Sometimes I don't really have the time to complete what I'm studying. So I'll get there eventually. I'll get there eventually. Yeah, so if you have too much nitrogen in your soil, it will actually increase the foliage on your plants. But then what will happen is that the stem of your plants will become spindly and it will not be able to support the plant. And then the root of the plant will be stunted and then the plant may even die. So you want to make sure that you don't have too much nitrogen. If you have too much phosphorus, then it will reduce the plant's ability to absorb micronutrients such as zinc and iron from the soil. And this will cause your plants to grow slowly and they may even die. If you have too much potassium, then this can prevent your plants from absorbing other very important nutrients. This might include calcium or nitrogens and so forth. So the plants will be stunted. So it's a good idea again to try to keep a balance. Now, nitrogen is important because it is what provides the plants with energy so that the plants can grow. As for the phosphorus, it helps the plant to have healthy root system and it helps to make your plant more winter hardy. It is also the nutrients that help the plant to transfer the genetic characteristic from one plant, from one generation to the next. So phosphorus is very important. Potassium is important because it helps your plants to transfer water, nutrients, and carbohydrates. So you don't want to have too much and you don't want to have too little of it. Let's see. LP says, I hear you. When you do all you have to have a little celebratory chat. We can all celebrate you. Okay. Thank you, Helpy. Let's see. I was spoiled this summer when it rained a lot. Then it stopped and I didn't keep up on my end. I think my plants were stunted. Oh, I have the opposite of you this year. We didn't have any rain. We got rain pretty much the last week of the growing season. So at the end of the growing season, I had all my tanks full of water and nothing to do with them because the growing season was just ending. So yes, we had the opposite. The garden. Let's see. Okay. Yes. So as regarding the celebration, I'm going to be doing a giveaway pretty soon, but then there is one of the gifts that I want to give away that I have to wait on, and it's going to take a little while for it to get here. So that is why I haven't done the celebrating just yet. Okay, so the fifth mistake, sorry, that gardeners tend to make is planting too close. Now, when you plant too close, then the air circulation is restricted. Plants need air circulating between them because that is going to help to control the moisture level, especially on the foliage of the plant. And it's going to help to control plant disease as well, because when there is not enough airflow to keep the moisture level on the foliage of the plant down, then the plant tend to be prone to a lot of plant disease, especially the powdery mildew. So for that reason, we want to plant close and plant with sufficient space between them. It is common, however, for a lot of us, we plant our garden, we plant with sufficient space. And when we're planting, we're not just keeping the size of the plant at the moment when we're planting in mind. We're thinking about the potential growth of each plant and allowing sufficient space. But if you're someone like me and you find a lot of seedlings coming up in your garden that you did not plant, you might choose to move it from where it is and put it somewhere else. And sometimes, in the process of doing that, we end up restricting the space or the airflow between the plants that we have because we feel sorry for the plants and we don't really want to dig it out and throw it away. So we try to transplant it somewhere else. Or sometimes we might just simply let it stay where it is. But doing so may end up causing our garden to be overcrowded, but then it doesn't really work out if we overcrowd the garden. Wood chip says, ooh, giveaway. Yes. LP says, I've been trying to convince my uncle to grow his cucumbers and tomatoes vertically because he had a lot of disease issue last year and a bad harvest. It sounds as if he didn't took your advice, did he? Yes. Yeah, it does pay to grow vertically. And one of the advantages of growing vertically, apart from the fact that it prevents overcrowding, is that it also provides you with more space to plant stuff. So anything that can be grown vertically, it is actually a really good idea to grow them vertically because the advantages far outweigh any disadvantage that it may have. Okay, so let's look at the sixth mistake that we tend to make as gardeners. And that mistake might be light management. So different plants have different amount of sunlight that it requires. So there are some plants that enjoy full sun, there are some that enjoys partial sun, and then there are those that likes the shade. So it is a good idea for us to know the type of plants that we are growing, how much sunlight or how much shade they prefer, and then plant them accordingly. Because it doesn't make sense to try to grow something in an area that is not ideal for it. And then at the end of the day, we spend so much time and energy and resources to grow these plants, but then the produce is not very good because we didn't give them the right condition for them to grow. So when we're planting, we have to take the light requirements of each plant into consideration. Another mistake is not preparing the soil properly. Different plants have different needs in terms of nutrients and in terms of the type of soil that you're going to be growing in. And so these are things that we need to keep in mind. There are some plants that like sandy soil, some might like loamy soil, well-drained soil, whatever the case may be. There are those that likes a lot of nutrients, some that likes a little bit of nutrients, some that likes a lot of moisture, some that doesn't. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration when we're preparing our soil for the plants that we're growing. There are some plants that love acidic environment and some that doesn't. So all of these things we have to take into consideration when we are planting, because that is what is going to help us to have a really nice harvest. And at the end of the day, that is the main reason why we're growing. Of course, there's all the benefits along the way, looking at the garden, seeing it grow, helping you to relax or de-stress. But at the end of the day, the produce is what we look forward to. So it is important that we do the necessary research in order to ensure that we are giving each plant the type of soil condition that it requires. And another mistake, and sometimes a very popular one too, is using the wrong container size for our plants. Seedlings grows very fast, and they tend to get root bound quite easily, so we need to up pot from time to time to ensure that they do not become root bound, especially if we have started our plants indoors long before the growing season actually starts, and the plants might outgrow the pot. Sometimes we plant in containers outside, but then the size of the plant as it grows, it might outgrow the pot, so we need to up pot. Or if we don't want to be up potting from time to time, we might consider just planting in the final size pot that we want to grow in. There are some plants that have a small root system. There are some plants that have really large root system. It is a good idea to know those plants that are going to have large root system. And larger plants usually require larger pots. So it is a good idea to ensure that we use the right size pots for the particular type of plant that we are growing. You don't want your plants to become root bound, because if that happens, then it is going to cause the plants to choke themselves. So using the right container is definitely worth the effort. You don't want to be growing your plants and not taking care of them properly, and then you end up with the plant dying and all your efforts would be in vain. So choosing the right size pot for your plant is a pretty good practice. Let's see, LP says next year I really want more tomatoes. I'm wondering if I should do the single leader pruning instead of letting my plants grow wild. Well, it is a good idea to do the single leader pruning, because when you do that, yes, you are taking off some of the branches that would be producing fruits, but you're also taking off the branches that are going to be using nutrients, a lot of the nutrients. So now the plant has time to focus on sending all of that nutrients to your fruits instead of sending it both to the fruit and to foliage. So pruning definitely works. And then you have, with all that nutrients going to the fruit, you have a larger fruit, a juicier, a tastier fruit, and you have, it's just a delight to even look at, and it keeps your garden looking a whole lot neater too. Yes, it looks nice when you see all those nice, bright green leaves looking all luscious on the tomato plant, and you say, oh, this plant looks healthy. But then if it is going to be, if having the foliage there is going to be taking away from the fruit, then definitely it is better to have the fruit than to have the nice tomato plant to look at. So I would definitely go with pruning the tomatoes. Let's see, LP says, exactly. I had a lot of plants this year, but not as many tomatoes as I would have liked. Plus, I have a short day of light. Oh, okay. With pruning, I didn't have a lot of tomato plants this year. I wanted to have a lot, but a lot of them didn't make it because of pests and all, but still wasn't too bad. But next year, I plan to plant even more tomatoes than I did this year. Hopefully, it will be more successful. Okay, so we were looking at container sizes. Yes, so the ninth mistake that gardeners tend to make is that they fail to take care of pests in time or to take care of them at all. So sometimes you will see these little creatures on the plants and you're not really familiar with them, so you just let them stay there and not do anything about them. But sometimes they are pests and they can cause serious harm to the plant, and sometimes they can spread plant disease as well. So it is a good idea when there are pests in your garden to get them under control as quickly as possible. And then another reason why you want to get them under control is that once these pests are satisfied that they can find food here, they will come back the following year and the year after that. And each year that they're there, they're going to be multiplying. And then you won't be able to have a nice harvest. So you want to get rid of pests as quickly as possible. So don't just leave them there. Some people are kind enough to say, okay, then they need to feed too, so just let them be. But then if you do that, the population of them will increase, and sometimes it can increase to the point where you don't really benefit from the things you have planted. So it's good to get rid of them as quickly as you can. Let's see. LP says, did you see my Instagram message that my gardener ships seeds to Canada? No, I didn't. I didn't see that message, LP. I haven't been on Instagram in a little while. Okay. So the next mistake that we tend to make as gardeners, especially for new gardeners, is having no plan for the garden. So we may not have to get all technical about planning our garden, planning out every little detail of the garden for the entire growing season. Gardening should be fun, so if planning out every single detail of the garden is something that robs you of the fun of gardening, then you can find yourself getting frustrated and not wanting to do it anymore. And then there are those of us who likes to sit and plan out every little detail of the garden. Some of us even go as far as to plan ahead as to what to do if problems arise. So having a plan for your garden is a very good practice, and one of the reasons why it is so important to plan your garden is that problems can arise whether or not you plan your garden. But when you plan ahead, then you can minimize some of the problems that may arise, or if the problems do arise, then you can handle it because you are prepared. Let's see. LP says, well, they do so. So if you want some new seeds variety, they will sell over 600 kinds of seeds. Okay, thanks for that, LP. Woodchip Gardner says, like me, I like the plant. Okay, good. And Han White says she likes the plant too. Everything concerning her garden. Yes. Initially I wasn't someone who plan out my garden. At least mentally I would have a little plan, but nothing intense. But as time goes by and I see every year different challenges arise, so now I started planning out my garden detail by detail. Yeah, so sometimes planning does not necessarily have to be something that you write down, although if you write down, then it's more likely that you will stick to the plan. Sometimes you can have it planned out mentally in your head, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be if you want it to, but what is important is that you have a plan. So, for example, say you are someone who doesn't like to sit and make a lot of plans, then what you can do is at least decide what you want to grow, how much space each plant will need, and ensure that you plant them accordingly. You don't want to overcrowd your garden, so you strive, and then you can strive to have a neat garden. So these are things that you might not have to be going around and writing down plan. As you go through your garden, then you can be planning as you plant. to ensure that at least your garden is very organized, it is very neat. Now, if you're growing in container, a good idea to keep your garden neat and to keep your garden organized is to ensure that for your containers, if you have containers that are the same size, the same color, the same shape, then you want to keep those together, because doing that will help your garden to be a lot neater. And then you also have to keep in mind walking space. So between your containers or between your plants, if you're planting in the ground or in raised bed, you want to ensure that you have sufficient walking space, which means that you have to consider the full potential growth of your plant to ensure that you have sufficient space so that you will have your walking space so you don't damage your plant in the process, so that it is easy to move around and to access each of the plants. You don't want to plant the entire garden and not leave walking space, because when you do that, you will find that you have to be stepping over plants. Sometimes you end up stepping on plants, breaking a stem here and there. So planning ahead, making sure you have sufficient space is a pretty good practice. Let's see, LP said planning is kind of fun. Yes, I agree with you. Planning is fun. If you have a large garden, it can be a lot of work. But the good thing about planning garden these days is that with the advance in technology, there are so many apps for those who like to use apps that they can use to help them to plan their garden. So it doesn't have to be so cumbersome. Yeah, so another mistake that we tend to make is controlling weed in our garden. We are all busy, so sometimes we don't really have the time that we would want to spend in the garden. Sometimes we are so busy that even if we want to go out there, we just can't make it out there. But it is a good idea to get weed under control as soon as possible. So you can either choose to select a day when you go through and weed your garden, or you may decide to, every time you're watering your garden, you pull a few of the weeds, and that way it doesn't seem to be a burden, because you don't have to be on it consist all the time, like for long hours when you're looking after the garden. So if you do it that way, instead of having to sacrifice time to be out in the garden when you could be doing some other work, just pull a few weeds as you go. Each time you see them, you pull a few, and then that way you will help to control the weed in your garden. Now, one of the reasons why it is so important, or several reasons why it is so important to ensure that you keep your garden properly weeded, is that weed will overcrowd your garden. You don't want your garden to be overcrowded, because like I mentioned before, if that happens, then it's going to restrict the airflow, which is so critical for your plants. And in addition to restricting airflow, it's going to be using up the moisture and the nutrients your plants need. Not only that, but then having weed in your garden will attract a lot of pests in it, and you not know that they're there, whether large pests or small pests. So getting rid of weed is pretty important to the garden. And the weed can actually stifle out your plants, especially if they are in the younger stage, or some weeds grow pretty big too, so they can actually stifle out larger plants as well. So keeping weed under control is one way that we can ensure that our plants will grow healthy and give us a nice produce at the end of the day. LP says, this year I let way too many volunteers grow. I think I let things get a little too wild. Okay. Yes, I do that sometimes, but in recent years, I have been trying to behave myself and not be too sorry for all the plants, because you can't save them all. So for that reason, I've been taking them out. But then when I feel sorry for them, I'm comforting myself with the fact that they're not really going to waste. They might not be producing anything, but They're going to become compost for the next growing season, or they're going to become food for my worms. So I kind of use that to comfort myself when I have to pull out those volunteers. It seemed to work. Okay. Yeah, so another mistake that we make sometimes is planting out of season. Now, depending on the ground that the zone that you are in, some plants will grow year round, while others may have to be planted at specific seasons of the year. Some plants will like the cooler weather, while some will prefer the warm weather. Now, even if you are planting in the right climatic condition, are you planting too early or are you planting too late in the season? Because all of these things will affect or produce. So finding the right time to plant is a good idea. So again, it is like I keep saying, it is very good to do research if you are not familiar with the growing season in your area. Do research on what grows best when, depending on what you want to plant. And then the next thing that you have to consider is that there are some plants that have a time during the growing season when they're most prone to pests. So where possible, sometimes it is not possible to do this, but where possible, it may be important to avoid planting at that point in time when your plants are more prone to pests. Let's see. Hi, Noir Gardeners. How are you? Hello in my British voice. How are you and everyone in this live chat? Okay, I'm doing well, my dear. How are you doing? Yeah, so keep in mind the time when pests that affect a particular plant is most active and try avoid planting at that point in time. Sometimes it may be that you have row cover or some other means of protecting your plant from the pest. So if that is the case, then fine, you can plant anytime within the growing season. Hi, Brandon. That's a question I wouldn't know the answer to, Brandon. LP says, I need to not feel bad about taking plants down too. Yes, you can always just put it in your worm bin or you can just use it as compost because at least when you're doing that, you know that the plant is not going to waste. So it might help you to feel a little bit better about the plant. And then think about it too in terms of you helping the other plants to do well. Okay, and White says she's doing well. Oh, hi, hands in the dirt. Okay, you're just dropping by just to say to show your support. Thank you for dropping by. Yeah, so it is important to keep these things in mind. But again, sometimes it may not be an option as to when you plant a particular crop because the growing season may be a short one. Let's see. Okay, Newark Gardner says, so glad, Anne. And LP says, so I've heard someone say that some old farmers plant their squash later in the season to avoid a squash borer. I think that only works if you have a longer growing season. Yes, if you have a longer growing season, then you can always play around with when you plant what. But like in my region, that is not really much of an option because the growing season is so short. The only things that I can start planting a little bit earlier than the growing season would allow would be like the cool weather crop. And then I don't get to plant late. I have to plant early, everything early because the weather here is so finicky that even if you know that your growing season would say end September, sometimes September you get snow, you get frost. So you have to make sure that you're either early as you possible, or you are right on time. But there is no leeway for planting late. Occasionally, you will have a year when you'll get a little extension, like we did this year, thankfully. But in general, it's just you got to get those crop in as soon as possible. Let's see. Okay, Precious is saying hi to Hands in the Dirt and Newark Gardeners as well. Let's see. Hans says, thank you, Newark Gardeners. I hope you are well too. Okay. Hands in the Dirt says, LP, Newark Garden, and Precious. So, okay. LP says, good point, White David. By letting all those volunteers grow, I'm letting the poor babies suffer. Yes, that is so true because they're struggling, they're fighting for the nutrients that is there, nutrients and the space. And says, it should snow on Saturday. Oh, you're getting snow on Saturday? We started getting snow, what, a little bit over a week now. Unfortunately, the snow is here to stay. Usually, when we get snow, initially, the snow would melt, and just every time we get snow, most of it the first snow, and it's just here to stay. Much to my dismay. Let's see. And why it's not on, but Noah Gardner says she's doing well. Okay, good. Yes, so another mistake, and this one I am guilty of, especially with carrots, is not thinning seedlings. I feel sorry for the poor little seedlings when I have to throw them out. And then I feel like it's just a big waste to throw them out. So sometimes I may not thin. So what I try to do now is for seedlings that I would sow close to each other like carrots, I try not to do that anymore. I try to give them sufficient spacing, and instead of sowing, I try to do like maybe two per hole and keep them with the required space, that way if one doesn't germinate the other will. So thinning is very important when it comes to your seedlings, because when you sow in a cluster, seeds will actually fight for the light, they will fight for the air, they will fight for the space and for the nutrients. So when the right amount of these are provided, or when they are not provided, then all the seedlings will underperform. So even though you may feel sorry for the plants, it is a good idea to thin them out, because the competition between them is going to prevent them all from doing well. So you have to sacrifice a few, unfortunately. Okay, and White says that's great that you're doing well. You are gardeners. Yes, so it is very important to thin out plants that are grown, that are sown in clusters. Now, when you are thinning, you want to look for the plants that are the largest, the healthiest looking, the stronger looking ones, and then the weakest ones, you pull those out. There are some plants that when you thin them out, you can actually transplant them. So if you're like me and help you feel sorry for the plants, then you may choose to transplant. There are some plants that does not like to be transplanted though. LP says she's terrible at thinning. I figured you'd be, because you're sorry for the plants. But yes, thinning is actually very important. There are some plants that are okay with being transplanted, and there are some that aren't. For the most part, you hear that carrots are not to be transplanted, but I've transplanted carrots and have success with them. But it's just that you have to be really careful with the plants because they're just so delicate. But carrots can be transplanted with care. Yeah, so you want to get rid of the feeble ones and keep the stronger ones. And a good idea too is when you are thinning your plant, you want to have a few extras. You want to have a few extras because something may go wrong with the ones that you actually want to keep, and then you would have to start over from scratch. So keeping a few extras will be pretty good. Let's see, I think I missed a comment from LP. She says, we've had a little snow and many of my plants are still alive, including lemon mint, which I think is the same as bee balm. Oh, okay. Well, that's good. The first frost we get and my lemon balm just didn't make it. I don't know. There are very few plants, only perennial plants, and lemon mint I think is perennial, but a lot of perennial plants don't really do well here because it's just too cold. The poor little plants don't stand a chance. But that's nice though that even though you've had your snow, it's still doing well. Okay, so where are we? Okay, so this mistake I have made, and I think I make it every year. I did make an attempt to correct this mistake this year, but to some extent I have failed, and that is labeling my plants. It is very important to label your plants, especially if you are a beginner. And the reason you want to label your plants is that a lot of plants will look similar to each other because they're of the same species, or maybe they just, for whatever reason, they look similar. So, say for example, you're growing basil. What if you're growing three, four different types of basil? If you don't know them by their appearance, sometimes they look identical, sometimes there might be some slight differences. Now, if you don't know them by appearance or if they're identical in how they look, then you may want to label them because sometimes, depending on what you're going to do with the basil, you might want this particular type of basil and not that one. So having it labeled is a good idea. You might have a lot of tomato seedlings, for example, and let's say you're growing beefsteak, Roma, and cherry tomatoes. They all look the same, but then you want to plant more of one type and less of the other type. Now you have all these seedlings, but if you don't have them labeled, how will you know that the one that you want the most of is what you're planting the most of? So it is very important to label your plants, right? So make sure that you keep your plants labeled. And then there are some plants that as they grow, they will, in the initial state they look identical, but then as they grow up they will actually change into their final appearance. So those definitely, you definitely have to keep them labeled initially because you want to make sure that you're planting the right thing. Yeah, so I made quite a few mistakes over the years with labeling, failing to label my plants. And then for this year I did label my plants, but then wear and tear and the label disappear. Yeah, so I end up not knowing what is what. And then what happened is I had my garden planned out where I knew what I'm going to be planted where. So for example, say I'm planting beefsteak, I knew exactly where, how many beefsteak, and exactly where they're going to grow. So there was no way I would get those mixed up because that's where I'm going to be planting them. But then with the issue that I had where I had too much fertilizer, too much compost to my work, to my raised beds, and the plants, some of the plants died. Didn't have, some of them I had the seedlings to replace, some of them I didn't have, so I ended up putting something else in that place. Now, all of that plan went out the drain as to having everything labeled what is what and what goes where. So it was, well, hopefully next year I'll be able to get it under control where labeling is concerned and try to use better labeling system this time so that the writings will not fade or get washed off. But we'll see. That's why I like gardening because there's always so much to learn. Let's see. Where were we? Okay, LP says, I will add that it's since melted. Okay, good. We're having a bit of roller coaster weather. Okay. LP says, oh my gosh, that scares me. That's why I'm not going to start seedlings in worm castings this spring. I feed my worms tomatoes, so how would I know which tomato is what I planted? Yes, what you can do if you don't want the seedlings to be growing is just throw the seedlings in the microwave and nuke it in there, and then you can give it to the worms. So that's what I do with tomatoes or any seed that is going to be that can germinate in my if I'm feeding it to my worms, I just throw it in the microwave and heat it. Yes. And then if it is large seeds like pumpkin seeds and stuff like that, then I'll just throw them in the food processor and refine it because they will want to grow and they take forever to break down. So I just throw them in the food processor and process them so the worms can break them down quickly and then I don't have to worry about them sprouting in the worm bin. Hi, grow in my home. You said you almost missed it. Okay, let's see. And says it is also important to have the date to the labels so that you know when to harvest. Yes, that's a pretty good point on white. Keeping the date so that you know when to harvest. And if you are someone who does succession planting, keeping the date when you plant each thing is also a good idea because you might decide that okay, every 2 weeks I'm going to sow some California Wonder Peppers. So having them dated, you know which one to transplant first, and yeah. So having it dated is pretty good idea. Thanks for that reminder, Han. And LP says good point, and White says thank you, LP. LP says it has also helped to have an idea what the seedlings look like. Maybe you won't know the difference between different tomatoes, but you'll know a brassica versus a tomato, for example. Yes, true. CLP says, I told myself I'd write it all down on a calendar when to harvest, but I didn't. It would help to write it on a label in case I forget. Okay, yes. That's true, because sometimes you say you're going to do things, you're going to put this in your notebook or in your calendar, but then getting the time that it takes to get there, sometimes you forget the information, or sometimes on your way to get that notebook, you get distracted by something else and you don't really remember what you were about to do, and then you end up not making a note of it. So yes, it's a good point. LP says, I figured I'll have worm castings after my seeds germinate. Okay. The thing is, though, that for your worm castings, if you put the fruits in there that has seeds, it is only the upper layer where some of the seeds are that will germinate. But then as you use the casting and you're going to be using it in thin layers, all of that layer that was covered now get exposed to the air and moisture. So the seeds on top of the worm bin germinated already, but the ones that are in the bottom of the worm castings did not have to be germinating later. Okay, so LP is saying hi to growing my own. Okay, Wood Chip Gardner says chicken love pumpkin seeds. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, they like it in your pulp. CLP says, I planted squash and thought it germinated, but luckily I was paying attention and planted another seed. I wasn't paying attention and planted another seed that came up different. So the first one was some kind of squash from my compost. Oh, okay. Okay, you're making your correction. Let's see. LP says, wood chip gardener. That's good info. I don't have chickens, but I know pumpkin seeds are good for a lot of creatures, including my birds. Raw, they are very nutritious. Okay. Yeah, I don't have any chickens. I would love to raise chickens, but I would have to be on an acreage to raise chicken because here in the city they tell you that you can raise 3.5 chicken. I'm not sure how you raise half a chicken, but that's the maximum that you can raise, 3.5. Yeah, so it's I don't see where it is beneficial to have just 3.5 chickens. Yeah, I would like to have, if I'm raising chicken, I'm just at whatever rate they want to. So, okay, so we were looking at thinning seedlings. So the next mistake that gardeners make, okay, I think I touched on that already, is labeling. Yes, I think we did that already. Let's see. LP says, I made the mistake of planting marigold that were quite tall along my garden bedsides. They shaded out other plants and probably took up a lot of nutrients, but they were beautiful in the fall. Oh, okay. Yes, I bought some marigolds, didn't know what type of seeds, what type of plant, whether it would be the dwarf or the giant ones that I was purchasing. So they grew pretty tall, not too bad though. I guess they were over 2, 3 feet, but thankfully they didn't grow to 4 feet because they would have overshadowed a lot of the plants in my garden. And a lot of them did not germinate either. So I'm thankful because if they had germinated, they would have been too large. Yes, they would have been too large. Okay, so what's the biggest mistake that you have made since you started gardening? The biggest mistake that I have made so far, I would say, is probably not dealing with pests fast enough because all of the other issues that I've had, most of them can be corrected, but where pests are concerned, not dealing with them fast enough and the damages that they caused was just too much. I've made quite a lot of mistake over the years though, where gardening is concerned. Overwatering for seedlings, I've done that, killed my seedlings by overwatering. Underwatering, oh, I'm famous for that in the main gardens. I'm famous for underwatering my plants. So this year I went a little bit crazy because I realized that I was constantly underwatering my plants the previous year. So this year I think I did fairly well where watering is concerned. And then what was the next big mistake that I made? Over fertilizing. Yes, I went a little bit crazy this year with the fertilizer, with the compost that I had it, but experience is good sometimes. There are some things you don't need to learn by experience, but then sometimes when you make mistakes or whenever you make mistakes, then you want to learn from them because they can help you to have a better growing season. Okay, you did the same, LB. Let's see. I'm growing my home, so the same thing happened to me last year with my marigold. So this year I knew better from my garden. Okay. Yes. So definitely won't be making that mistake next year. I will try to see. I don't know if I'm gonna be starting the marigolds from seeds next year. I'll try to probably get seedlings from the garden center. Well, that depends still on whether or not they put out their marigold seedlings early or late. But yes, I think next year I would like to get the seedlings. See, and White says I allow pests to kill all or most of my herbs because I didn't know what they were. Yes, that was the reason why my pest issue was terrible too, because I didn't really know what they were. So allowing them to stay caused serious damage. So hopefully next year we will learn from our mistakes that we have made over the years and make adjustment accordingly. And so we'll have a really, really nice harvest. I'm just hoping that we will have a fairly good weather next growing season, because pretty much everyone you talk to this year about gardening is just one extreme or another, or a combination of extremes. Yes, but well, we can always be hopeful and just do our best so that the next growing season will be better. And even if it is not better, at least we can be satisfied that we did our best. So there's nothing more that we could have done. Yes. Yeah. So anyway, I am going to be saying goodbye to you guys shortly. Yeah, so there are quite a few mistakes that years, especially as beginners, that is when we make so many mistakes, but we learn as we go. Let's see, LP says, I allowed squash vine borers to get to my squash underwater late in September. Poor planning. Okay. Well, all of these are just training for us so that the next time around we'll do better. I am certain that with all the experiences that we have had since we started growing, we're still going to be making mistakes, because there are just so many different mistakes to be made. And then the next thing is that sometimes we might be growing a particular plant for the first time and don't really know much about growing that type of plant. So wherever you take it, we're going bound to be making mistakes. But the good thing is that we keep learning and adjusting as we go. Okay, you're gonna be starting your marigolds from seed. I'm growing my own. Okay, yes. I did save some of my marigold seeds, and I still have some in the package that I bought because I didn't plant it all out. So I still have those, but they took so long to grow this year that I'm baffled. But then I don't know if it is the marigold itself that is the problem, or could it be because I had the issue with the curly top virus? If that is what caused it to be stunted or to grow so slowly, I don't know. But to be on the safe side, even if I'm growing from seeds, I'm still going to be getting some seedlings. LP says, good point, White Davy, and we have great garden buddies here. That is so true. That is so true. We can help each other out. Okay, good night, Anne. Oh, your potatoes are cheating. Interesting. Yes, my sweet potatoes, some of them, the purple sweet potatoes, some of them are actually starting to produce slips or sprouting already. But hopefully I'll use them up before they do anything. I'm not sure what's going on with my potatoes. I haven't checked on them since I put them in storage. I didn't even, to be honest, if you hadn't mentioned your potatoes, I wouldn't even remember. that I had potatoes in storage because my husband went and bought some potatoes and I've been using those. I didn't even remember that I had potatoes that I've harvested. So I'm gonna have to check on them sometime during the course of this week. Okay, you're starting a fire, Morgan. We'd have probably 5 days of frost. Okay. So you're asking if anyone knows if you can save them for next year. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how if we can save them from next year because we have the entire winter ahead of us. Your winter might be a bit milder than mine, so I don't really know. Hopefully, someone, let's see, precious. I need to plant my potatoes. They all have eyes and they're ready to be planted. Oh, so you have nice weather that you can actually plant your potatoes now? That's cool. Yeah, so I don't know. It depends on the climatic condition. It may depend on the climatic condition, Melanie. But I don't know if you can save them until next spring because chances are, if they're somewhere, you keep potatoes in a dark place, cool, dark place, chances are if they're chitting and they're in there, they're going to be growing in there. So it's not just a chit, but the plants are actually going to start growing spindly. So I don't know if you were in an area where they can grow outside over the winter. I don't know. Why not try planting a few of them now, outdoors if possible, and see what happens. Will they grow next year? Will they stop growing for now and then sprout next year, or will they freeze? That would be a nice little garden experiment. Oh, it's 17 California. We are in a drought condition. Okay. Wow. I would enjoy some of that weather now. I would take even 55. Anything as long as it's not freezing, I'd be happy for. Yeah, so anyway, I'm going to be saying goodbye to you guys. It was nice chatting with you again. Glad that you could be here. Thanks for your participation. And I hope you will have a successful garden next year. So stay safe until we meet again, hopefully Friday at noon, my time, of course, Saskatchewan time. So have a lovely evening or a lovely night, everyone.